What's the only thing we have to fear? Fear itself. All right, good. Nameless, unreasoning terror. So tonight, I know we're doing this our series, topically. I know that, and that our broad general topic is Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, and the coming and the winning of World War II. And I know that. I understand that. However, we need to build not a wall. Thank you. All right, thank you. I know, I can't help myself. It just falls out of my mouth. That we need to build a short bridge from 1920 to the New Deal and in 1932. Let me build this bridge quickly and briefly with you. That the Great War of 1914, and we know that the Great War of 1914, that for Woodrow Wilson, and I know you remember these phrases, that this war must be the war to end all wars, that this is a war that we are entering, to make the world safe for democracy, and Wilson idealism, Wilsonianism, and Wilson 100 years ago, Northborough had voted for Woodrow Wilson in November of 1916 on the pledge in November of 1916, 100 years ago, to keep us out of war. That we are not going to get involved in this war. This is an old dynastic war of European interests, in that America's role, my role, will be to be a moral force in the world rather than a military force. That I will be the honest broker, that I will be the peacemaker, that I will do God's work, and I will bring peace to Europe, that the new world will save the old world from its sins of war and blood and tyranny. Woodrow Wilson was caught up in this. Woodrow Wilson was born between the dictionary, the dictionary and the Bible. And by that I mean the dictionary. He was quite a wordsmith. He really could put together a very well thought out and reasoned speech. And his father was a minister, and his father-in-law was a minister. So for Woodrow Wilson, it's to do good, and brought up between the Bible and the dictionary, that the role of the United States, the new world to save the old world from the bloodletting of World War I. I am a peacemaker, not a war maker. And yet, 5 months later, maybe 5.5 months later, he's elected in November, sworn in March. Back then, the inaugurals were in March. Sworn in March, and in April, 5 months later, he goes before Congress to ask for a declaration of war. Not for colonies, not for monetary goals, not for an attaboy, but rather a noble ideal, Wilsonianism, idealism, to make the world safe for democracy. And we're in that war by July of 1917, and in the 18 months that America was involved in the war, we had 115,000 deaths. So, our casualties, our fatalities were nothing like World War I. And, next year, 2017, is the anniversary of America getting into the war, the centennial. We could do a whole course, and I have, just on World War I, the run-up, the war, and the aftermath. And we're going to skate it in about 10 minutes because we have a large topic here tonight. And so Wilson, at the end of the war, will travel, the ceasefire, all quiet on the Western Front. The 11th month, November, the 11th day, and the 11th hour, 11 a.m., all quiet on the Western Front. And Wilson will travel to Paris to represent the interests of the United States. And this is the Paris Peace Conference. And this was the most stellar and glittering collection of delegates ever to gather since 1815, when Napoleon had been buttoned up at Waterloo, and the Congress of Vienna, hosted by Metternich in Vienna tried to put all of Europe back together again. And here it is a century later, 1918, 1919, that all of Europe gathers again to heal from World War I. And what we all remember from school days, at the Paris Peace Conference, I mean, there were 4 major treaties. We all remember the treaty with Germany, and the Germans do too. Adolf Hitler did. And that is the Treaty of Versailles. That's the one we remember. I know you've heard about that, the Treaty of Versailles. But there were treaties, there were other treaties as well, with Turkey, and with Austria, and with Bulgaria, who had sided with Germany. But for Wilson, the major treaty was the treaty with Germany, to make certain that the seeds of another war were not sown in a treaty with Germany. And his vision of a treaty to end World War I, which did not fit with certainly David Lloyd George of Great Britain or Clemenceau of France, his phrase that the treaty we write must be a treaty in which there are no winners and there are no losers. A peace without victory. This is Wilson. A peace without victory. A peace among equals, between equals. And for the British and the French, this was unacceptable. Not after these casualties. 4 years of the Western Front, the machine gun, trench warfare, the no man's land. We need to crush the Germans. And from that, came the Treaty of Versailles, in which the nation of Germany, I'm making a point of this because it's going to lead to World War II, in which the nation of Germany accepted reluctantly, they had no choice. They accepted the fact that they'd started the war all by themselves, which isn't true. The blame pie can be nicely divided up for World War I. It cannot be divided up for World War II in Europe. I mean, that was Hitler's doing all by himself, no doubt about that. But to accept the full price of the full blame for the war, to pay for the war, reparations, and to lose land, and to be denied an army, a navy, and an air force, and to blow up their submarine pens. This was a war. This was a piece of victors upon the vanquished. And Wilson objected mightily. He said, "You cannot do this. The way this treaty is written, it's a war treaty, not a peace treaty." And he nailed it. He didn't want to. The treaty was agreed to in 1919, but he said, "You're going to have war in 20 years. If this treaty stands, unless you revise it, rewrite it, rethink it, if it stands as I'm presented with it, you're going to have another, your children, your grandchildren will reap the whirlwind of this treaty. This is not a peace treaty. This is a war treaty. And you're going to have another war in 20 years. He did not want to be correct, but of course he was. World War II broke out in Europe in September of 1939, when German armies crashed into Poland to regain land that they had lost by the Treaty of Versailles. And Wilson hoped, he hoped that his plans for his prescription for peace, the 14 points, that if you accept all of my 14 points, which in many ways was a prescription to avoid war. And think of the 14 points as an RX. And most of them were ignored or severely compromised, except for Wilson. The crown jewel of his 14 points was number 14. And that was the League of Nations. And that if all of us will agree to join the League, and we can negotiate our differences rather than fight about them, we will be able to diffuse the causes of war. And maybe tonight when you go home, look over the 14 points, and you can see how point by point by point, that they were designed, drafted to limit, to prevent the outbreak of another war, because the next war will be greater. And Wilson knew that. They all knew that. And Wilson will get the British and the French to agree to join the League of Nations. Wilson brings the treaty home, and the American Senate rejects membership in the League of Nations. I want to make this clear here and to our audience that American entry in the League of Nations, in my view, would not have prevented World War II at all. And I mean, Adolf Hitler and many right-wing parties in Germany found their voice with what was called the Diktat of Versailles, the Dictator Treaty, and the men who signed that treaty and the government that accepted that treaty, the ill-starred Weimar Republic, needs to be condemned and needs to be destroyed. That these men who signed this treaty were the November criminals, that they sold away the rights of Germany. And this new Weimar government is part of the criminality of accepting this lost war. And if we come to power, we will sweep Europe with a steel broom. I'm quoting Adolf Hitler. We will sweep Europe with a steel broom. And he was dismissed, rightly so, as a crank. The German Workers' Party, 7 members. And he was member number 7, with Arthur Anton Drexler. So Wilson brings this treaty home, and the American Senate rejects it. And the man who led the fight against the treaty from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge oftentimes gets criticized as being the bad guy in all of this, and I want to speak in his defense. Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge had an issue with Woodrow Wilson. He thought he was too arrogant, too big for his britches, that he's going to simply present this treaty, we're not going to read it, talk about it, amend it, and that Woodrow Wilson simply wanted us to rubber stamp it. Our job in the Senate, checks and balances, is to read a treaty and provide our advice and consent. And Lodge was doing his job. And I know that many historians dismiss him as being a malcontent and wanted to show up Wilson. Well, he didn't like Wilson because Wilson was arrogant and a know-it-all, and I think he was related to John Adams, who was an arrogant know-it-all as well. But Wilson, I bring this home. I bring you the way, the light, and the truth. I will accept no changes in the language. And I'll be brief here, it's more nuanced than this. For Lodge and the Republican Party and those who supported him, the major objection to the language of the treaty is that the members of the League of Nations meeting in Geneva, men we don't know, men who are faceless, that they have the authority, the way this treaty is written, to send American troops abroad without the approval of Congress. Back then, there was the odd habit that only Congress may declare war, that the president cannot simply dispatch troops at his leisure, that we have to abide by the Constitution, and that a war has to be declared by a Congress, not by one person sitting behind a desk in the Oval Office and calling it a police action or whatever I almost said she, whatever he wants to call it. So Lodge, this has to be done constitutionally. Men in Geneva, whom we don't know, have no authority to commit American troops to Ireland, he's thinking of the British, to put down another Easter rebellion. I have Irish constituents. We have no business helping the Brits crush the Irish, because every time you hit them, they get back up. That's never going to go away. That isn't our fight. The French in Indochina, we have no interest there. So if American troops are going to be committed abroad, it's in the interest of the United States, not the members of the League of Nations. Wilson didn't want to hear that. So that treaty comes up for a vote, and it gets voted down. And again, in my view, that Henry Cabot Lodge of Marblehead or Manchester or whatever, Manchester by the Sea, a pretty shabby neighborhood, by the way, that he was doing his constitutional job as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I'm doing my constitutional job. We need to read it. We need to evaluate it, checks and balances. We need to make suggestions. And this treaty, as it is written, Mr. President, is not in the national interests of the United States. If we can maintain control of a commitment of American troops, then we have a deal on the table we can talk about. Well, Wilson wanted no part of it, and the United States never joins formally the League of Nations. That in no way had anything to do with the outbreak of World War II in Europe or in Asia for that matter. I mean, the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese eventually joined the League, and then they all pulled out anyway. I mean, no one's going to tell us what to do. And in the aftermath of World War I, there was this hunkering down in the country. And Warren Harding, the 1920s see three Republican presidents: Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And Hoover's the guy, it's on Hoover's watch, that we have the Great Depression. And Harding, running in 1920 for the presidency, if you sent down to Central Casting and you said, send me someone to play or to run for the president, they would send you Warren Harding. Good-looking guy, strapping, broad shoulders, steely gray hair, a great voice, looked presidential, sounded presidential. Wasn't very presidential, but he presented well. He interviewed well with the voters, and he ran and won on a slogan, on one word that was not even in the dictionary. It is today. And the one word that he ran on and won, the word was normalcy. Normalcy. And by normalcy, he meant to come home. As my grandmother would say, M-Y-O-B. Come home and we mind our own business. Let's not talk about making the world safe for democracy. Let's talk about making America safe for America. It's not isolationism. I mean, we had observers at the League of Nations, and we signed, and the country signed, if you will, treaties in which we reduced a military number of ships and tanks and so forth. But nonetheless, to come home and mind our own business. And by normalcy, he meant get married, raise a family, go to potluck suppers, and do normal things. Enjoy baseball, the national pastime. Back then, it was the national pastime. I don't know what is the national pastime today. I think it's the internet or being on Facebook, which I loathe. I loathe. I'm not on there at all. I loathe it. And you have to come and find me. I've told you, I tell my sons, do not email me. You call your father. You call your old man, all right? Well, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And pass the hat right now. Get it going. So it's normalcy. And it's Coolidge and the Roaring '20s and to be new fashion rather than old fashion. And let's enjoy life, because the war has shown that life could be taken away that quickly by the trenches, and even more devastating and frightening. I mean, it's one thing to enlist, it's one thing to be drafted, and to fight on the Western Front. But an event that took even more lives than World War I globally was the Influenza Epidemic of 1920. That affected everyone. In the morning you were well, and in the evening that you were in well, I'm from Illinois, it was called a Chicago overcoat, and that meant a coffin. And that dealt with prohibition and all these gangsters murdering each other, that you're going to be in a Chicago overcoat tonight. Bet you haven't heard that phrase. I know that because you're not from Chicago. I am, all right? And I know what a Chicago bankroll is, and that's a Chicago term as well. So it's keep cool with Coolidge, have a good time, and the Roaring '20s. Be new fashion rather than old fashion. And buy. Enjoy it now. Why wait? Why wait? The war can take you away. The flu epidemic can take you away. Enjoy your life now. Be young. Be careless. Be reckless. Enjoy your youth now. Dorothea Parker summed it up beautifully. We burned our candle at both ends. And when the flame sputters out, it's done. But live it now. Don't be like your grandmother. Wait. You got 2 dresses, 1 pair of shoes, and a bonnet, and everything is paid in cash. Spend, credit, enjoy it now, because you're going to be dead a long time. enjoy it now. The Roaring Twenties. And that's, of course, all by itself, isn't it? In 1928, Herbert Hoover was elected president. And Herbert Hoover ran on a very homely slogan. And I know you remember it. Two cars in every garage. No, a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. Why a chicken? It was lobster. All right, it was expensive. And 2 cars, not 1 car in every garage. And Herbert Hoover, who had been elected to nothing in his life. He was a successful businessman, a multi-millionaire over and over and over again, and elected to nothing. And I hear it, I hear it, I hear it, I hear it. Thank you. I hear the buzz, I hear the rumor. And all we need to do is run the country like a business and make America great again. All right? That everything will come roaring, everything will be great. Good, better, best. And running against Al Smith. And Al Smith, so many negatives. A Catholic. Oh my God, a Catholic. His loyalty is to the Pope, to the Bible. And he's the governor. He's the governor of New York, which within the boundaries of New York has Sin City, New York City, the Big Apple. There was a Little Apple in the Garden of Eden. New York City is the Big Apple. Crime, prohibition, the speakeasy, all these floozies, all these card games, all these sharks, my kind of town. All right, and is this a cocktail president? Does America want to elect a cocktail president when we are dry here? You know, with the wisdom and the morality of the 18th Amendment? What a disaster that was. I mean, the 18th Amendment turned a nation of law-abiding citizens into lawbreakers. And you know what's interesting about that amendment is that you can teach, you can weave so much into the amendment, what brought it about. And one could do an hour, you know, one could do a seminar, you know, just on the 18th Amendment, you know, and all the intended and unintended consequences to the noble experiment, you know, to get the country dry and clean up the morality of this country. Herbert Hoover, dry, self-made millionaire. Herbert Hoover. Things are good under these Republican presidents. I've never been elected to anything in my life. This country is going to rock with a Hoover administration. He's elected in November, and November of 1928, and in October of 1929, the stock market crashes. Now, it wasn't Herbert Hoover's fault. It had to do with deep systemic problems in the economy that had been bubbling along for 10 years. And basically, without getting into the details, because we want to finish tonight, that the basic problem was overproduction and underconsumption. You can only purchase so many radios or refrigerators or televisions. How many toasters do you need? You cannot put a toaster in the living room. You ought not, or maybe in the bathroom. It was overproduction and underconsumption. And eventually the layoffs came, and when the layoffs came, there was no safety net. I mean, there's no Social Security, and there's no FDIC, and all this wildcat banking, and suddenly the unemployment began to increase enormously. There was not very much unemployment in Northborough. You're a farming community. You're self-sufficient. You're not in the Rust Belt. You know, you're not in the manufacturing centers. And the unemployment got to staggering levels. By the time Hoover was up for re-election in 1932, depending on where you lived, the unemployment rate was 25, 26, 28%. Massachusetts had the lowest unemployment rate in the nation in 1932. The unemployment rate was 13.2%. And what kept it cooking was the fishing industry, lumber, and textiles. But across the country, 24, 25, 30%. And that number was soft because many people simply stopped looking for work, didn't they? So I mean, those numbers were staggering. And Hoover's advice was, do not worry. The economy will come roaring back. These problems are the result of the lost war in Europe and reparations and bad loans and so forth. The American economy is sound. The virus, the economic virus of Europe has affected the American economy. And all we need to do is wait it out. Tighten your belt, wait it out, and look for help at the local level. Ask your family, ask your church, ask the Red Cross. The American economy will come roaring back. Do not panic. And just as Theodore Roosevelt went to the bully pulpit, Herbert Hoover went to the bully pulpit. There is nothing wrong with the American economy. Hang on, tighten your belt, it'll be back in 6 months. And 6 months became 1930 and 1931, and then the election year of 1932. The American people are patient, and they are forgiving, but there's been no progress. And Hoover's name now, how embarrassing for him. Hoover's name was now used not to celebrate him, but to denigrate him. Hoovervilles. Around the big cities, Hoovervilles. And then a Hoover flag. A Hoover flag, you walked around with your pants pocket turned inside out. You got a dime? Brother, can you spare a dime? You have a nickel you can spare. The apple became a symbol for a nickel, a symbol of the New Deal. A Hooverville, a Hoover flag, a Hoover blanket. A Hoover blanket was you took newspaper and stuffed it inside your worn coat. So Hoover soup, hot water and ketchup. You can make it in 60 seconds. You can make it tonight. Maybe you had it over here. I don't know. Hoover stew. Same thing, except throw in some vegetables you dug out of the garden or dug out of a tin can behind a restaurant. Now, not everyone lost their job. I mean, some people read about the Depression as if it were happening in a foreign country. But in 1932, I mean, the country was desperate. It wasn't revolutionary. I mean, there were pockets of that. But we want a change. We cannot re-elect Herbert Hoover. And the Republican Party renominated him in 1932. The Democratic Party nominated Franklin Roosevelt. And I've always thought, that it was of interest, that a man who had contracted polio, that will lead the country back to prosperity and during World War II, from his seated. And that's why Ken Burns, when he did his Roosevelts, said Franklin Roosevelt, not Washington, not Lincoln, was the greatest president, because he worked the Depression through and World War II seated. And that spirit that he had. And again, what's the only thing we have to fear? Fear itself. For Franklin Roosevelt, these are economic problems. We can fix these problems. And if you've spent 6 years, 7 years, 10 years in a wheelchair, we can solve these problems together. That Franklin Roosevelt, bad things happen to good people all the time. And just because these don't work does not mean this doesn't work and this doesn't work. And when Roosevelt sought the nomination of the Republican Party, of the Democratic Party rather, forgive me, that he would object to that. He would object to that mightily. And when Roosevelt accepted the nomination of the Democratic Party, that he went to Chicago to accept the nomination in person. And you're thinking, well, big deal. It happened last week and it's going to happen this week. But it was a big deal. Back then, you were at the convention city, but you waited for the leaders of the party to come to you in a hotel room or maybe in the basement of the convention center and say, you've been nominated, will you accept it? And then you're supposed to go through the drill. Oh, I can't believe it. Be still my heart. My mother will be so proud of me. What does it pay? All right? Roosevelt, there's no time for that nonsense. I'm going to be at that convention, and I'm going to accept the nomination in person, and I'm going to walk to the podium and accept it. And you heard me right, walk. When Roosevelt had to walk, he could walk. Not too many steps, but his sons would help lift him out of the chair. Later on will be the Secret Service, and he would have his cane, and he'd pull himself along, and his sons would have him, by the arms, and he would say, "Don't drop me." He would go right to the floor. I mean, he had no strength in his legs at all. "Don't drop me." "I won't, old man. I won't, old man." 10, 15 steps to the podium, waving at the crowd as best he could, and then gripping the podium, which always had to be nailed, bolted, because that kept him up. If it wasn't, and he grabbed the podium kept right on going, and so did Franklin Roosevelt. And it happened often. And the Secret Service would pick him up, dust him off, and everybody would pretend this is perfectly normal, you see. This happens all the time. They straighten out his braces, and off Roosevelt would go. And Roosevelt never felt that. He was concerned that people might think he wasn't up to the job, so that he wore his trousers long and to hide the braces, and he had the braces painted black as well, just to mask them a little bit. And it did not bother him. He felt that some people might think that he's not up to the job. And he went to that convention. And what is this man going to say? Nobody really knew who he was. I mean, he had experimented with some work programs as governor of New York. And as he paused and the delegates waited, he had a wonderful voice. He had a voice made for promises. Roosevelt made house calls over the radio. And he had that trusting, mellifluous voice and optimistic. What Eleanor and Franklin gave the country in the 30s and the war years, hope, optimism, and confidence. You can't measure that. That isn't a poll number. It's how people feel. Hope, confidence, and optimism. And Roosevelt, at that convention, telling the delegates, and his voice going across a suffering land, and people listening on their Philcos and RCAs and Emersons. What is this man going to say? And he told the country that you have not failed. This Republican administration has failed you. And I have your interests at heart. The time of waiting is over. And if you gift me with your vote, I promise the delegates here tonight, and I promise the nation, a new deal. It's time to get this country moving again. And everybody is up and roaring. It was the voice. It was the confidence. It was that finger. And you have not failed. This Republican administration has failed you. And if you gift me with your voice, I will mobilize the powers of the federal government in ways in which it has never been mobilized before. Thank you very much. And that's FDR. And, of course, the press picked up on the phrase, New Deal. Governor Roosevelt, what do you mean by a New Deal? He didn't know. He didn't know. One of his speechwriters, Sam Rossman from New York, had slipped it in, lowercase, New Deal. I mean, it was the applause line. What do we mean by New Deal? I don't know. But boy, it brought the people to their feet. And of course, I can see Roosevelt. I'll tell you what I mean by a New Deal. I mean, what do I mean by a New Deal? Well, we know it meant jobs, didn't it? And in that inaugural, and we know the phrase, but the phrase that I want to come back, we haven't heard yet tonight, Roosevelt in that inaugural, he knew why he had been elected. And in that inaugural, he told the country, our greatest primary task is to put the American people back to work. And from that, Roosevelt announced, he told his members of the cabinet that tell your missus, Roosevelt always called women your wife, your missus. Men don't do that today. Tell your missus, and for Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever to serve in a cabinet position, tell your husband, none of you are going to the parties tonight. We're going right across the street right now to be sworn in by Justice Benjamin Cardoza, and we're going to start working now today on this. We're not waiting until after the parties. We're going to do it now. And the good news, you're going to get an extra day's pay. And I'm calling Congress back in a special session. And this is the legendary 100 days of the New Deal. And in those 100 days, and later on, of course, we have the first and the second New Deal. And it's to put the American people back to work. Now, I'm just going to tick off a number of work programs, which went across the nation. The New Deal changed government. It changed everything. It was big government, big presidency, and the president initiating legislation. When the framers drafted the Constitution, they saw the job of the president as being executing the will of Congress. Congress passes, and the president executes the will of Congress. Roosevelt turned it on its head. It's never been the same. Big government, big taxes, and all power goes to Rome. All power goes to Washington, D.C. And everybody's been campaigning against the New Deal since time out of mind. That the New Deal was the raw deal. The New Deal, that Franklin Roosevelt was that man in the White House. Remember that? That man, that cripple. That the D in FDR stood for delirious. The guy's a communist. My grandmother, who raised me for many, many years, and my brother, loathed FDR. She was a Republican's Republican. She was a Republican in the womb. Margaret loathed FDR. I never told her. She was so pleased when I finally earned my PhD. But don't ask, don't tell. She said, your mother would be proud of you, surely. That's why she raised us. And I never told her what I did my dissertation on. It was on Roosevelt. It was on FDR. And I know if I told her, there would have been a silence, and then there would have been a bang on the floor. She would have died. It would have done her in. And the will, I would have written out of the will. It was all mine and my brother. And I never told her. And she was just pleased. That man, that cripple, he destroyed the country. I'll tell you one more quick thing and then we'll get back. I have to share this with you. That I got this story years later when I would understand what it was. Roosevelt was one of the founders of the March of Dimes. He's on the 10-cent piece. I got this story later on because I would never have understood it. Apparently, Margaret, once a week or once a month, would comb through her pocketbook and take the dimes because it had the image of FDR, and they came out in 1946. You can't be on a dime or a stamp until you're dead, so you're going to have to wait for a while. All right, you're going to have to be on a stamp or a coin, all right, or on a bill. And she would throw them out. And her thinking was, apparently, if I throw enough dimes out, I will cleanse Illinois with the face of Roosevelt, if I throw enough dimes out. Now, that's neurotic, but that's her. Looking back as an adult, she was neurotic in many, many ways, in entertaining ways as well. But to comb through your purse and throw dimes out, to eliminate the face of Franklin Roosevelt in Illinois. Now that's something to dedicate your life to. Margaret, thank you. That man, to put the American people back to work. And we all remember the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and the PWA, the Public Works Administration, NYA, the National Youth Administration, to put young men and women to work who, rather than quit school and help their families out, would get a job at the school or somewhere doing small tasks. The big one, which all over this state, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tree Army, and to put the American people back to work. Roosevelt was never comfortable spending all this money. Frankly, he was a fiscal conservative. But somebody has to do something. And we have to jumpstart the economy and get people spending money and draw down all those inventories. Roosevelt hoped that over time, he didn't know when, But over time, that when the economy, when the private sector began to recover, that he could reduce jobs in the public sector as the private sector recovered. And we can switch from public and back to private jobs. He did not want, he certainly, unlike in Europe, did not want a dole in the United States. People go to work. You get up and you feel better when you go to work. And in that New Deal, the National Labor Relations Board supporting unions, a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour. Then it became 25 cents an hour. The Tennessee Valley Authority, Social Security, FDIC, that when Roosevelt called Congress back into session for those 100 days, he only wanted them back for one purpose, and that was to save the banking community. Sounds like Bush and Obama, doesn't it? If the banks continue to fail, 60% of America's banks had failed during the Great Depression. We have to stop the hemorrhaging, save those banks, and get the others back online. And Roosevelt called Congress back into session just for that. It was called a bank holiday. Actually, it was called the Glass-Steagall Act, but a bank holiday. And he called it a bank holiday. It sounds less threatening, doesn't it? And I'm going to send out federal, state, and auditors to check the banks out. And those banks that are deemed being solvent, they'll reopen. And when they reopen, you can withdraw up to $10. Now, $10, you could get a meal for 25 cents. I mean, he did not want another run on the bank. But to stabilize the banking community and to stabilize Wall Street, who hated him, he's saving them. I'm saving you. And they hated him. You are a traitor to your class. In 1936, the Roosevelts, Eleanor was out there. See, Eleanor went where Franklin could not go. She's a great lady, and she went, I do a whole thing just on Eleanor Roosevelt. Do you guys have a screen in here? Right there. I do a piece just on Eleanor. And she was everywhere. She was the eyes and ears and legs of Franklin Roosevelt. Her nickname in the press was Eleanor Everywhere. Eleanor Everywhere. Criticized for not being at home with the children and being home with her husband who needed her. She was not exactly a role model as a mother. She was a great-grandmother, but she was a lousy mother. But she had 4 or 5 children. There were 21 divorces among the Roosevelt children. 21. Can you imagine trying to keep that straight at Christmas? You you got to work at that. That's a record of some sort. 21 divorces among your children. You got to work at that, and then try to figure out who belongs to whom, because you all kind of look alike, to some extent. And in 1936, the New Deal, and the Roosevelts were up for re-election. And this was an historic victory in 1936. The Roosevelt won every state in the Union, every state except 2. He ran against Alf Landon of Kansas. When's the last time you heard that name? When's the last time you were in Kansas? Hands up, hands down. Excellent. He got crushed. Alf Landon got crushed by the New Deal. As I said, he carried every state except Maine and Vermont. Now, there are more cows than voters in Maine and Vermont in 1936. It was an historic victory. The people in New Hampshire, in between Maine and Vermont, were so embarrassed that Maine and Vermont had not supported the New Deal, that on all the roads and bridges leading out of New Hampshire to Maine and Vermont, they erected enormous signs. And the signs read, "You are now leaving the United States of America." Is that great? Is that great? And the New Deal coalition, 75% majorities, Democrat majorities, in both the House and the Senate. The New Deal, was everyone's New Deal, and except for those, that man, that cripple, the D is for delirious. And slowly, the unemployment began, the numbers began to go in the right direction, albeit slowly. It will take the war, and we know this, don't we? It'll take World War II to bring full employment and full recovery. the men put on a uniform, and Rosie the Riveter goes into the shipyards. Everything changed when Rosie the Riveter went into the shipyards and the aircraft factories and figured out, one, she can do the job, she can be a manager, maintain quality control, and make a good buck and get the job done. I can do this. And Rosie the Riveter changed everything, after World War II. I know it took time. I know that June Cleaver showed up right after World War II, vacuuming high heels, right, and making sure that Ward had his pipe in the paper in a martini when he came in. And Harriet Nelson as well, right? But I mean, it took time for all of that to work through. But nonetheless, all wars are game changers. They change everything. Certainly, the GI Bill, the country was never the same after the GI Bill. It built the middle class, the GI Bill. It gave instead of having the economy look like this, it went like that. A bulging middle class with the GI Bill. Jobs, education, technical training, going to college, and it was the sons and daughters of those men and women who went to school on the GI Bill who also went to college, because there was a model, there was a precedent. There was an expectation, you see. And it's all about expectations in many ways. What's expected of me. A real difficult word for me is to hear or to be able to deliver, "You have disappointed me." And you have disappointed me. Rather than anger, "You have disappointed me." And to me, that's a little more rendering, isn't it? Right? You have disappointed me. So, Franklin Roosevelt. By 1938, frankly, forgive that one. By 1938, the New Deal was up and running, and war was looming. 1939, war in Europe. Hitler's blitzkrieg, Hitler's panzers, crashing into Poland. Depending on where you lived, the World War II in the Pacific, the Japanese invading China in 1937, Mussolini, into Abyssinia, Ethiopia in 1935. And Roosevelt knew that war was coming. He knew, he couldn't say it. He couldn't say it because he'd been elected for domestic reasons. But he knew. Roosevelt was the old sailor, wasn't he, the mariner? And Roosevelt could smell the wind was changing, was beginning to turn around into the... Are you going to go vote for Roosevelt? Vote early and often. You're not voting for Roosevelt. Roosevelt, the old sailor, that he knew the wind was changing from the northeast in the wind direction, and that the barometer was dropping and the clouds were lowering themselves, and those rolling waves over the Atlantic and the Pacific were being whipped by the wind, and those white caps being snapped off the top of those waves. War was coming, and there was no safe port for America. He dare not say that. He had to wait on events. And in 1937, he really understood that. He went to Chicago, and in Chicago, at Soldiers Field, not Soldiers Field, yeah, in Chicago, that he delivered what was called the quarantine speech. And he simply asked a rhetorical question. And the press said, "What?" And American public opinion said, "What?" And the question was, what are the good guys? What's the responsibility of the good guys to quarantine the growing menace of war in Europe and Asia? What do 90% of us do to quarantine the bad guys? And he never used the word quarantine, but it became the quarantine speech. And Roosevelt was asked, "What do you mean by that? Is this a change in policy? Are we getting involved in a war? Are we getting mixed up?" And Roosevelt said, "Oh, no. Oh, no. I didn't say quarantine. I said Listerine. That's what I said. That's what I said." So he backed off, and frankly, he had to wait on events. And that brings us, Roosevelt always thought that World War II, American involvement in World War II, would occur in the Atlantic. A German U-boat would torpedo an American ship, and that would be the cause of war. It came at Pearl Harbor, like you don't know that. It came at Pearl Harbor, and Roosevelt standing Great speech. Great. It's 6 minutes and 30 seconds. And standing, and as commander-in-chief, a date with December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Not a day. That's too soft, isn't it? A date which will live in infamy. Then I always have to tell my students what the word infamy means, which is okay. All right, that's what I do. That's my job, all right? I don't know where he got that word. He must have, cherry-picked that out of a thesaurus. Roosevelt didn't, typically speak like that. A date which will live in infamy. And, oh boy, and he had that Episcopalian anger. You can tell when an Episcopalian is angry because they talk like that. They talk like that. My grandmother was an Episcopalian. She talked like that, Boys, boys. And my brother and I would hear that. Boys. All right. She counted the cookies again. All right. She knew. She knew. She counted dimes. She counted chocolate chip cookies. Boys, boys. I can hear it. I'm saying it. I got it in my ear. And it sounded just like that. And that was a long time ago in a far and distant galaxy. December 7th, 1941. We're at war in the Pacific. And a few days later, December 11th, the Italians and the Germans declare war on the United States. And frankly, in 72 hours, 96 hours, we are fighting a two-front war. We are ranked 39th as a world power. And ranked 40 is Portugal. So that's where we stand in December 7th of 1941. That this is a peacetime army, a peacetime nation. And suddenly we have to rally, don't we? And and whom do we attack first? And of course the decision on the part of the Joint Chiefs and Marshall was that we need to go after the Germans. They're far more militarized, their industry, their technology, that they are a much more of a threat than the Japanese. So I'm just going to use this as a blanket generalization, that it's a holding action in the Pacific. We've only got so many troops. And if we're going to go to war aggressively, it'll be against, the Axis powers. And Roosevelt delivering those fireside chats, and there's one beautiful fireside chat. You can pick it up on the internet. He asks the American people, and this is Roosevelt, so avuncular. See, people would say to one another that I don't know the president, but he knows me. He knows my problems. He's helping me. He knows me. I don't know him, but he knows me. And Roosevelt, delivering a fireside chat in March, it might have been 42 or 43, asking the American people, bring your maps to the kitchen table, because I'm going to have my map here. And I'm going to tell you where your gallant sons and daughters are fighting in Europe and in Asia, and pronouncing the names of islands that people had no idea what they sounded like and where they are in location to, I almost said Argentina, Australia, or where's Guadalcanal? Guadalcanal, I never heard of Guadalcanal. I heard the Suez Canal. What's Guadalcanal? That sounds like a procedure. So Roosevelt explaining, where our troops were. And in those conferences with Stalin and Churchill at Casablanca, unconditional surrender, there'll be no terms. And then D-Day. D-Day was the turning point in Europe, wasn't it? And that's a great topic all by itself. Just D-Day, and Eisenhower putting that together. And everybody knew it was coming. And June 6th, 1944, and D-Day. This was the beginning of the end, and a thrust across northern France. It was a bloody thrust. It took from June of 44 to June to April of 45 to end it. But that's the end of the beginning. By that I mean the end of the beginning of the war in Europe in 1939. And at Yalta, a dying Roosevelt at Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt should never have run for a fourth term. I'm a Roosevelt guy, you know that. Even I'll say, he was dying. I mean, it was clear death was working its way through his face. He knew it, and he knew it. And Roosevelt, very privately, an Episcopalian, was a religious man. He kept it under the jacket. And he prayed for the Lord. I'm running for re-election, and I know I shouldn't. But give me enough breath and enough heartbeats so I can see the close of the war. Victory in Europe, victory in Asia, and then take me. Take me. I can join the other 400,000 plus men, who have given their lives that the nation might live. Take me. Just give me enough breath so I know there's been victory. Didn't happen, didn't it? In April of 1945, the great voice was stilled for that day and all days. But at Yalta, that deals were made with Stalin. Churchill was there, and that whole conference is so controversial, or I can make it controversial anyway, right down to today. And what Roosevelt wanted from Stalin at Yalta was two promises. One, you will join the United Nations, that we need to rebuild the UN. We need a more vigorous UN, and we're going to put it in New York and not in some mountain range in Geneva, Switzerland, with Heidi and the elves and the goats. We're going to put it in New York where we can keep an eye on it. And secondly, I need your help against the Japanese to attack from the north, to attack down from Manchuria, because he had the numbers about an invasion. And Truman suddenly president. We'll talk more about Truman next time we meet. He had been 83 days as vice president. He didn't have a clue. He was the least prepared president of the 20th century. He did not spend a single day in a college classroom. And that shows you the benefit of not going to school. All right? That really, I'm talking the plus side of that. All right? Common sense, good judgment, wisdom, and listening to people. I mean, there's an upside there. And Harry Truman making that decision when he finally was coached up on the Manhattan Project to avoid those deaths. And the numbers were all over the place, weren't they? 250,000 American fatalities, 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million. No one knew. And for Truman, this was to save American lives, not Japanese lives. The Japanese were vilified. They were demonized in this country, weren't they? And that's another story, whatever. And only later on did the narrative expand, which was true, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japanese historians will tell you this, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, saved Japanese lives, as well as American lives, because American intelligence had picked up the Japanese slogan for resistance. And the slogan was, 100 million people die proudly. We will not surrender to the round eyes. And that's why Roosevelt wanted Stalin's help attacking from the north down through Manchuria to share those fatalities with Russian soldiers. But Harry Truman didn't hesitate. When the word came that there had been a successful explosion at Los Alamos, and Harry Truman sent a warning to the Japanese. It's coming. Sudden death out of a clear sky. You had better surrender. Nobody knew what he was talking about. Neither did he. I mean, nobody really knew what they had. And Harry Truman, August 6th, August 9th, bang, Hiroshima, boom, Nagasaki, end of the war. The emperor surrendered. The emperor got on the radio. Nobody ever heard the emperor's voice before. And the emperor got on the radio and simply made the observation that we must, as he said, the emperor, Emperor Hirohito, that we must bear the unbearable and that we have to surrender. And that's a whole story about the economic and constitutional recovery and philosophical recovery, of the Japanese after 1945 and the onset of the Cold War, when suddenly Joseph Stalin was no longer Uncle Joe. By the way, he loathed the phrase Uncle Joe. When Roosevelt said, back in the United States, people call you Uncle Joe, boy, did he freeze up. Uncle Joe, like I'm some circus clown? Uncle Joe, I can have everybody at this table shot. Here was a sick man. Stalin, he really was a sick man, delusional, sick man. And and Uncle Joe. So Roosevelt stopped calling him Uncle Joe. But for Harry Truman, now Joseph Stalin and the USSR have moved quickly from wartime ally to Cold War adversary. And I'll leave you with this and we'll do some questions. And this is Truman, a very different man. We'll talk more about him later. A very different man than Franklin Roosevelt, very different. Franklin Roosevelt's favorite color was gray, and his favorite word was ambiguity, because I want to keep everything in a state of flux. Let me pray on it. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you. I mean, that was Roosevelt. I'll get back to you. And maybe he did, and most likely he did not. For Harry Truman, it was pretty much black and white. And for Harry Truman, I'll leave you with this. The only difference, this is Truman, the only difference between Hitler and Stalin, the size of their mustache. That's what I'm dealing with here. So you know that much about Harry Truman. You know how he felt about Joseph Stalin. Franklin Roosevelt always felt, I can deal with Stalin. You know, we need to understand him, to treat him like a man and a brother. Harry Truman, there's no difference between him and Adolf Hitler. And that, when you have that mindset, it shapes the way you relate to Stalin and the Soviet Union. One could do, and I've done it, one can do a 15-week course on the Cold War. And the Cold War has a starting point. You can start it, you can measure it right there. 1946, Winston Churchill, Fulton, Missouri, announcing an Iron Curtain. It ended on the Gorbachev, the Yeltsin watch, when the flag of the USSR was taken down from the Kremlin and upran the flag of Russia. The Cold War had ended. As George Bush said, George H. Bush, freedom finished first. During the war, the major dailies always ran the fatalities for the war somewhere. And on April 12, 1945, that as the following day, the 13th, the fatalities for that date, April 12th, were listed, and alphabetically. And there it was, Roosevelt, Franklin, Commander-in-Chief. He would have liked that. I did my duty, as God gave me the light and the strength to do my duty, and I served my country. And I, too, am a casualty of that war. He would have liked that touch. He liked that touch. I mean, he was a bit of a commoner as well. He always put down on his 1040, that his occupation, he put down farmer. I mean, Hyde Park. I'm just the guy, a personality. Churchill said, the first time you meet Franklin Roosevelt, so it's like opening a bottle of champagne. His personality bubbles all over you. That man, that cripple, delirious. I'm going to throw every dime out I have in my pocketbook. So, like lots of great men, great women, great events, it depends who you see and what you want to see, and it's like taking the, what's that, when you look through the kaleidoscope, and you look at the light and you keep turning it. The more you turn it, the different shape you see and the colors, and you see what you want to see. And we all do that, don't we? When the WPA was presented to the Senate, to the Congress, Harry Hopkins, who was one of the alter egos of Franklin Roosevelt, was the director of the WPA. And Harry Hopkins got that very same question you raised. A fiscally conservative senator from, let's say, Nebraska, asked a true and important question. He's asked, how are we going to pay for this? What does this mean in the long run? What does this mean in the long run? And Harry Hopkins paused for a moment, and he said, Senator, with all due respect, people do not eat in the long run. They eat every day. We're going to print the money. I know. Roosevelt was never comfortable with that because you get in trouble. It's irresponsible. But we need to do something. The New Deal was sensitive to the arts, and there was the Writers' Project, the Music Project, the Painting Project, and so forth, where you're not going to put a paintbrush in a painter's in a guy who's a professional painter and put him to painting walls. They did murals, on post offices. That there were the theater groups were formed. The unemployed historians were hired to do brochures for Gettysburg, Lexington, and Concord, and so forth. It had an amazing social impact as well. The New Deal was everywhere. Here's a word I can use every once in a while. I can't spell it, but I can pronounce it ubiquitous. It was everywhere.
Yeah, you can't put a price on that.
No, you can't. No, you can't. But for those people asking that question, the New Deal changed everything. This country has never been the same since the New Deal. Social Security, FDIC, minimum wage, unions, the protection of children. I mean, everything flows. So much flows from the New Deal, and the ground and the prop for that was Theodore Roosevelt and his Fair Deal. And the New Deal grew from the seed of the Fair Deal, under the impetus of war and massive unemployment. The government as the last guarantor of jobs to provide for the economic, social, and physical well-being of we the people in order to form a more perfect union and to secure the blessings of liberty. We live with it today. Like it or not, you live with it today. And the only way it's going to go away is if we have a nuclear war or some epidemic. It's there. It's in your pocket. You carry a Social Security card. You collect Social Security. Medicare. I mean, that's huge. Medicare grows from the New Deal. For Lyndon Johnson, his hero was Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. I want to model him and do more and to help the American people. And from that came the Great Society that we'll talk about. Without the Vietnam War, Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson would be among the near-great presidents. Roosevelt was prepared to go home in 1940. I'm done. 2 terms and I'm out. That was the tradition. And he was packing. He and Eleanor were packing. And the leaders of the Democratic Party came to Roosevelt. Knock, 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 knock. Eleanor, don't tell them we're here. All right? Knock, 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 knock. And they said, Mr. President, will you run for a 3rd term? And he said, no, I'm going home. The tradition is 2 terms and you leave. And then they changed the question. If you are nominated, will you accept the nomination? If you are nominated, will you accept it? He said, I'll accept it, but I'm not going to Chicago to ask for it. I'm going to send my missus. And Eleanor went to Chicago, was the first woman to address a national convention. My, how things have changed. The first woman to address a national convention, accepting the nomination on behalf of her husband. And Roosevelt said, oh, by the way, Eleanor, love of my life. He never called her love of my life. You know that. Never. My missus. That make sure Henry, twist the arms of the delegates and get Henry Wallace on the ticket with me. So she's down there to accept the nomination and to make sure that the delegates put Henry Wallace on the ticket with them. Yeah, I'm done. But war was coming, and he knew it. And he was that sailor. And the skies were darkening, the wind was turning into the northeast. Those waves were rolling deep, and those white caps whipping off the top of the waves. War is coming, and there is no safe port here. The American scientists at Los Alamos, they knew all these men. I mean, all of these men had worked together, and they had shared papers, and they knew all of them. And at the end of World War II, it was called Operation Paperclip. And Eisenhower, I'll give it to Eisenhower, that there were, think of manila folders with paper clips on them. First, second, third round draft choice. Which German scientists, physicists are we going to grab? They knew who the good ones were. And we got our number 1 draft pick. We got von Braun, all right? And he put Neil Armstrong on the moon. And the Soviets had their people as well, and they rounded up their people, brought them back, and they threatened to kill them. We grabbed our guys, we brought them back, gave them jobs at Princeton and Columbia, sanitized their resumes. You know, you weren't Nazis. You never used Nazi labor. Yeah. All right, we're going to give you a job at Princeton and put you to work, you know, to build us better rockets, jet aircraft, and to put a man on the moon. Wernher von Braun put Neil Armstrong on the moon. And praise the Lord that the national bird was an eagle and not a turkey. Remember, Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey, didn't he? Neil Armstrong could never have said, could he? The turkey has landed. He couldn't have said that. I mean, I couldn't have said that. I said, I'm not going to say anything. It'll be a silent landing, silent night. Who chose Harry Truman? I'll talk about this next week or next month. Roosevelt chose Harry Truman. Roosevelt did not know Harry Truman really well, but he knew he was a good New Dealer. He had no skeletons in his closet, and he was a man he could trust. And Truman said, no, I don't want the job, please, no. And then Roosevelt, loud enough so it came over the receiver, you tell that fella, Truman, you tell that fella, he called guys fellas, you tell that fella that if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of the war, I'll do it. Now I've got to tell my wife. Speaking of fella, you go to the Roosevelt Library, and I've been there, and you put on the archivist gloves, and you're looking through. It's always interesting. I do this. What people have in their libraries, or more importantly, what newspapers do they subscribe to, and what magazines are around. And sometimes there's nothing. Nothing. Are you sterile? I mean, do you only get it from the news at 7 o'clock? Don't you read? My place there's stuff all over the place. I got stuff from 2010 I haven't read, but I'll get to it. That newspaper from 2010, I'll get to it. And you're going through the Roosevelt Library, there's a copy of Mein Kampf. And it caught my eye, Mein Kampf, what's that doing there? So I pulled the book down, I opened it up, and in the preface, in Roosevelt's hand, is a phrase, keep an eye on this fella. Woo! Talk about an insight and an oversight, right? Keep an eye on this fella.